Right now, your retirement account is probably betting on artificial intelligence. You never signed a form for that. You never clicked yes. But if you own an index fund, a 401k, or almost any basket of American stocks, a large slice of your savings is riding on a handful of companies racing to build AI. 10 firms now make up about 40% of the entire U.S. stock market. Together, they plan to spend more than $1 trillion on chips, data centers, and power over the next few years. And everyone, from Wall Street to your group chat, is asking the same question: is this a bubble? Here is the strange part. This exact story has already happened. Not with the internet in 1999. Earlier. It happened in Britain in 1845, around a technology that promised to change the world: the railway. And when it was over, the technology had kept every promise. The country was transformed, and an entire generation of investors had still lost their money. That is not a contradiction. It is the whole lesson. Start in 1830, when the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened. It was the first real intercity line on Earth, hauling cotton, coal, and people between two booming industrial towns. It was also a money machine. Within a few years, it was paying its shareholders a dividend close to 10%. A dividend is just the cash a company hands its owners each year. 10%, backed by iron and steam, in a country where government bonds paid 3%. Who wouldn't want a piece of that? For a decade, railways spread slowly and carefully. Then, in the mid-1840s, the brakes came off. Interest rates were low, so safe savings earned almost nothing. A new breed of railway newspapers appeared, dozens of them, hyping every scheme. And the rules were loose. Anyone could launch a railway. Survey a route, print a prospectus, sell shares to the public. By late 1845, the railway schemes on the table added up to roughly the size of Britain's entire annual national income. Scale that to America today, and it is as if investors proposed nearly $30 trillion of construction in a single year. Now imagine you're a schoolteacher in Leeds in 1845. You have 200 pounds of savings, about $30,000 in today's money. Here is the trick that pulls you in. You don't have to pay full price for railway shares. You buy Scrip. You put down 10% now, and the company can call in the rest later, when it needs the money to lay track. So your 200 pounds controls 2,000 pounds of shares. If prices rise 10%, you have doubled your money. This is leverage, and nobody used that word to you. Prices are rising every week. Your neighbor is in. Your minister is in. Why would you be the only one left out? Everyone was in. The Brontës sisters put their family savings into railway shares. Charles Darwin owned them. More than 150 members of Parliament were railway subscribers, which mattered, because every new line needed an Act of Parliament, and Parliament was approving them by the hundreds. In 1846 alone, it passed 272 separate railway acts, authorizing thousands of miles of new track. And towering over it all was a man called George Hudson, the Railway King. A draper's apprentice from York who came into an inheritance, bought railway shares, and kept buying until he controlled roughly a third of every mile of track in Britain. Hudson's companies paid famous, fat dividends. Here is how. When profits were not enough, he quietly paid dividends out of capital. In plain English, he used money from new investors to pay old investors, which made the railway look wildly profitable, which pushed the share price up, which attracted more new investors. 75 years later, the world would learn to name that trick after a man called Charles Ponzi. In 1845, it just looked like genius. What could possibly go wrong? In the autumn of 1845, the Bank of England began raising interest rates. Money tightened. Share prices stalled, then slipped. And then the machine that had made everyone rich went into reverse. Because here is what the school teacher in Leeds forgot. That cheap 10% deposit came with a promise attached. The railways now actually had to build their lines, so the calls went out. Pay the next installment, then the next. Families who owned £2,000 of shares on £200 down suddenly owed money they did not have on shares that were falling. So they sold, which pushed prices lower, which panicked more holders, which triggered more calls and more selling. An index of railway shares that had roughly doubled in 2 years gave it all back, and by 1850 it had lost about 2/3 of its value from the peak. The damage did not stay inside the stock market. At the height of construction, historians estimate railway building was swallowing roughly 7% of Britain's entire national income. Scaled to the American economy today, that is like spending around $2 trillion a year on a single technology. When that fire hose of money sputtered, it helped drag the whole economy into the crisis of 1847, a panic so sharp that one October week of bank failures was remembered simply as the Week of Terror. And Hudson? In 1849, investigating committees went through his books and found the fraud. The railway king was disgraced, stripped of his empire, chased by creditors across Europe, and even spent time in a debtor's cell. He died in 1871 with almost nothing. The Brontës sisters' shares, by the way, were in one of Hudson's own companies. Here is the twist, and it is the part that matters most. The railways were not fake. About a third of the approved lines were never built, but the rest were. By 1850, Britain had more than 6,000 miles of track, triple what it had before the Mania. Freight costs collapsed. Fresh food, cheap coal, and daily newspapers reached ordinary towns. The railways even changed clocks. Before them, every town kept its own local time, and it was the railways that forced the whole country onto one standard, the ancestor of the time zones on your phone. The technology delivered everything the believers had promised. It transformed the country and repaid its cost many times over for society. For shareholders, returns settled at around 2 or 3%, less than boring government debt would have paid. The value was real. It simply flowed to the users of the network, not to the people who financed it. So look at today through that lens. A technology that is clearly real. Spending measured in fractions of the national economy. 10 companies making up 2/5 of the stock market, with your retirement savings along for the ride. The same 3 questions apply now that applied in 1845. Is the technology real? For railways, the answer was yes, and investors lost anyway. Who gets rich during the build-out? Whatever happens later. In the 1840s, it was the promoters, the contractors, and the iron makers, paid in cash while shareholders were paid in hope. And when the bill finally comes due, who is actually holding it? That last question is where the parallel honestly breaks, in 2 ways. First, the funding. Victorian railways were built with the leveraged savings of ordinary households, and the calls on those shares turned a market decline into personal ruin. Today's build-out is funded mostly out of the enormous profits of the richest companies in history, with borrowed money only creeping in at the edges. A downturn would hit stock prices and index funds with them, but the chain reaction that bankrupted school teachers has no obvious modern copy. Second, the hardware. Victorian iron lasted a century, so even the overbuilt lines kept some value. A cutting-edge AI chip is often obsolete in about 5 years. If the Victorians overbuilt, at least the overbuild endured. Silicon ages differently, and nobody yet knows which way that cuts. None of this tells you what to buy or sell. History cannot do that, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something. What history can do is hand you the right question. Your retirement account is betting on artificial intelligence, just as a school teacher in Leeds once bet on iron and steam. Her technology kept its promise. Her bet still failed. Because the question was never whether the machine works. The question is who pays to build it and who gets paid when it does.